Hello, I'm Rosie Serdiville. I'm a local historian and I'm here to give you an alternative view of the Battle of Newburn, if you like. My colleague John Sadler has already spoken a bit about his views. And now I'd like you to think about those people who perhaps were not so committed to the royalist side. I'm going to argue that a lot of people in our area were, if not exactly indifferent, more interested in getting on with their own lives, and in many cases quite sympathetic to what the parliamentarians were saying. This is the monument to the battle, not somewhere that most of us have had a chance to go and look lately, but one of these days I'm going to get back there and it's going to be very interesting to do so. The site of the Battle of Newburn Ford lies approximately 4 miles west of Newcastle in the floodplain of the river. At one time, before the Tyne was straightened in the last century, its meanderings were far more pronounced. It's quite easy to appreciate how the slow-moving Tyne, although very wide at that point, could once have proved fordable at Newburn, which of course was the point of the battle. It's where the armies could get across. But that also made the area ideal for all sorts of other early industrial uses. This is a really interesting comparative map put together by archaeologist Jenny Morrison. And as you can see, what she's done is take two views of the river before and after it was altered. In the first one, the river is of varying widths and in many places was just too shallow for large vessels. A large island known as Dean's Meadow prevented free passage. The shape of the river at that location led to this section being known as the Crook. In the lower plan, you can see the river at Leamington after the improvements of 1876. The commissioners designed the river to be a lot more sinuous and they standardized the width, and importantly, they made it much deeper by dredging out Dean's Meadow. Of crucial importance to Leamington, the river was rerouted, leaving Leamington Point isolated at the end of what would become known as Leamington Gut. That's where the name comes in. On the other side, you've got a battle plan which shows the two armies on either side of the river in the period before the bridge existed. What looks like a bridge across the river is actually the fording point. The mile-long meadow where the local force gathered in 1640 is still there, with the towns of Ryton and Stella on the heights above at either end. The enemy, meanwhile, were on the north bank of the Tyne, on the Newburn side. And we get a picture of how built up Newburn was from a description at the time. A local commentator tells us that the Scots, having the advantage of the rising ground above Newburn, could easily see the position and motion of the English. But the posture of the Scots army, the English could not discern by reason of the houses, hedges, and enclosures in and about Newburn. It was a small town in 1640 and it's a small town now, but that's about all that they have in common. In terms of industry and enterprise, it was punching far above its weight in the 17th century. And that had an impact on what the local population thought about the conflicts that we now call the English Civil Wars. Of course, local people resented the Scots' occupation of the town. We're well aware of that. The Scots had mounted their cannon on the Tower of St. Michael and All Angels because of its prominent position over the river. Scots troops occupied local buildings and provisioned their army using local supplies. But there was very little looting, something which was experienced by people on the other side of the river, occupied by the drunken and raucous militia brought in from Newcastle, who were far less disciplined. The Scots issued promissory notes for what they took. People were going to be paid. It just might take some time for it to arrive. And they were far more disciplined than their Geordie foes. Of course, a lot of people had already fled Newburn as it became clear that the battle was going to happen, seeking shelter in Newcastle itself. But regardless of the impact of the two armies, people's view of Crown and Parliament had as much to do with their economic status as it did to do with any sense of regional or political affiliation. And that sense of who you were and what mattered to you had a great deal to do with how the landscape around Newburn had evolved in the preceding centuries. At this stage, Newburn was a small village grouped around its church in the first fording place west of Newcastle. And around it were small, probably hedged enclosures, and perhaps a series of small coal pits. The south bank of the Tyne had a broad area of low-lying flat land between it and the higher flood-free land running between Stella and Ryton. That flood-prone land was called Ryton Haugh, and to the west, Ryton Willows suggested some woodland. Both would have been used as meadow for summer grazing and would have been either open land or sparsely fenced. South of this lay a bluff, behind which lay the small settlements of Ryton and Stella. The area on both sides of the river was remarkably well supplied with paths, roads, including what might have been a drove road, and wagonways taking coal to the staiths. And the maps of the period show a number of large farms and substantial estate buildings. The alteration in the course of the river 200 years later had the most significant impact on the area. On the eastern side of the battlefield, the river's course used to follow what is now the borough constituency boundary. At one point, the boundary line curves slightly in midstream where there used to be that small island, Dean's Meadow, that we talked about. And that's the location of Kelshaw Ford, one of the two fords that the Scots used during the battle. Because while the main ford was the one that everybody was after, there were actually three in total available to them. The main one probably lay close to the present-day Newburn Bridge, and the other ford, also known as Kelshaw, crossed further east from Stanners Island towards the southern bank opposite Hedgefield. As regards buildings from the 1600 in the battlefield area, apart from Newburn Church, which still exists, we know that Ryton Church and Mott, the remains of an early castle, would have been present, as would a medieval manor house at Stella, which was demolished in 1955. There may well have been a medieval peel tower just east of Newburn in the Stanners area, and at least some of the houses in the village would have been stone built. We know that a 17th century stone built house was demolished as late as 1909. So we're talking about significant high status buildings. This was an area of real importance. Newburn had an abundant supply of water to power mills of all sorts, not just grain mills. In the late 16th and early 17th century, water power was employed to drive grain, textile mills, to crush ore, to work trip hammers for iron, brass and wire manufacture, and to drive wheels for sawmilling and knife grinding and paper making. There was extensive fish farming using weirs and dams, and of course there was the all-important coal trade developing. Industry stimulated the growth of what had originally been rural communities, and they'd been expanding for some time, wealthy enough to attract families from outside the area to move in and take up leases. Enclosure started in Newburn earlier than in other parts of Northumberland, as industry and commerce made it more valuable than using the land for simple farming. So you had a mixed and very healthy economy with many families carrying on one or more businesses supplemented by agriculture rather than that being their main business. It was increasingly common for women to be responsible for these additional businesses, in some cases acting as employers in their own right. They were part of the emerging middle sort, the middle classes as we come to call them. And this made them at least ambivalent on the issue of Crown versus Parliament. You see, for the middling classes, the question of what you did with the money that you generated from your business became a key issue. If you were of the old higher status or noble groups, then you simply took it for granted that you'd invest your money in land. But these were people who were land poor, but increasingly cash rich. They had money and they wanted some way of making it grow. There was no banking system, no stocks and shares system. If you wanted to invest money in another business, then you had massive problems getting it transported. We know that jewelers emerged in this period as people who could take on resources in one area and issue letters of credit in another part of the country based on those holdings of simple coins. Those letters of credit would turn into the banknotes of our era. The other issue that faced this emerging middle class was actually getting a say in the governance of Newcastle, which was the third most important city in Britain at the time. And the governance is very much based around trade rather than the old higher status noble communities. The hostmen, the merchant adventurers, controlled trade and were very reluctant to allow any new bodies, people who weren't part of the old guild system, to get involved. This emerging merchant class, who wanted to have a say in the trade of their own area, as well as in what happened to their profits, were naturally more likely to side with Parliament. They took the view that economic liberalisation and control by elected representatives was more likely to benefit them. The hostmen got their control over the coal trade in particular via royal franchises and were more likely to support the crown because this was the source of their status and their wealth. Of course, there were also some Puritan religious groups in the Newcastle area, particularly people who were connected to Scotland. In fact, that was a weakness because they were seen as being connected with the Scots economically as well as in terms of religious beliefs. The ordinances against allowing Scots to trade in the town were very much a protectionist policy. They were about stopping people from outside coming in and doing business. And those Puritan businessmen who were also looking to expand their trade had a vested interest in siding with the Scots to some extent as the civil wars got started. Because, of course, the first civil war was very much a conflict between Charles I and the Scots over the issue of the rights of bishops and the sort of prayer book that should be used. Loyalty to the crown or to Parliament could easily be outstripped by passionate defence of your right to maintain trade and business. And that loyalty was tested not just during the period of the wars between Crown or Parliament, but in the period afterwards, when you saw people whose natural loyalty would be to Parliament actually questioning control because it was interfering with their personal right to do business. Here we have an image of a local woman, Isabel Orde, having her tobacco confiscated by the town authorities. The picture relates to a dispute over tobacco duty. Arthur Hazelrig, governor of Newcastle, found himself interceding in one such case over a consignment that had been labelled as foreign owned and liable for duty when it's not. Here, Isabel, dressed in what is very middle class clothing, is having her roll of tobacco confiscated while she's selling it in the market. And as you can see from the pack horse being hauled off in the background, we're not talking about small quantities. Isabel is a businesswoman trading in a very expensive commodity that's been imported to Newcastle from overseas. And she's a woman who's got social status and wealth in her own right. She's not happy with the town's governance or with Parliament, who are placing restrictions on her right to trade. The impact of the civil wars was a significant but short-lived drop in the total economy of the local area during the 1640s and 50s. Newcastle was attacked by Scottish and parliamentary forces in 1640 and was besieged and occupied again during the period from 1644 to 1647. Oops, I've gone too far. This is a reenactment of the Battle of Newburn in 1640. As you can see, you've got soldiers portraying both sides in the battle, and it can be quite hard to tell them apart. We're used to modern armies in very distinctive uniforms, but this was the period before that had really taken hold. Local militias were equipped and provided with uniforms by whichever officer had put the militia band together, and they could be quite varied. By and large, the Scots in their hodden blue-grey were quite distinctive, but you could have the parliamentarian side wearing red, as you could find on the royalist side, and Newcastle's militias on the royalist side actually wore white coats, which gave a name to their company. Trade had been continually disrupted in 1637 to 8. Problems included clashes with pirates from Dunkirk and crosswinds, but the threat of the Scottish invasion as the civil wars heated up was enough to send a number of Newcastle's tradesmen, including those from Newburn, running for the hills or further afield. The contemporary historian and lawyer John Rushworth explained the extent of the problem. Newcastle and the coal mines, he said, that had been wont to employ 10,000 people, had now not a man to be seen, not a coal was wrought, all absconding, being possessed with a fear that the Scots would give no quarter. Many families, he told us, were gone, leaving their houses and goods to the mercy of the Scots, who possessed themselves of such corn, cheese, beer, etc., as they found. It's likely that the population ended up cursing both sides in the conflict. You can see why some parts of the country had local militias called clubmen, developed to see off anybody who had designs on local property. The siege of 1644 had an immediate impact on the economy. The royalist mayor, John Marley, had held out against Scottish forces between February and October, eventually retreating to the castle itself. The siege resulted in the destruction of a portion of the physical town, and it stopped shipping. All Saints Parish Church was burned, as was the mayor's house and the Guildhall. According to William Gray in 1649, and this is an ardent royalist, the suburbs to the north and west had been ruinated by a combination of enemy action by the Scots forces and wanton destruction by the royalist Earl of Newcastle, who burned buildings to slow the approach of the Scots. Notwithstanding, we're told, the cries of many poor widows and fatherless children that begged him with tears to refrain. Mercifully for the coal trade, Sandgate, the eastern quayside suburb, escaped the fury of these wars, except some near the walls of the town which were fired, we're told. As a result, the siege left only a modest dent in the demographic record. Enough survived to tell us of a large number of illegitimate soldiers' children, many of them explicitly Scottish, helping to fuel a population boom in the later 1640s. There's a generally lower level of burial in 1644 to 5, which is probably due as much to under-recording as it is to a falling population. The surviving registers for those years are chaotic, with some months missing entirely and others out of chronological order. That's due in part to the burning of some church records, although the civil administration of Newcastle also struggled to stay on top of its paperwork during the disrupted siege years. The stoppage in shipping was intense but relatively short-lived. Only 200 ships arrived in Newcastle in 1644 instead of the usual 3,000. But by 1648, business was already recovering, with 1,200 ships coming through. And by 1652, the number was back up to its pre-siege numbers. The North's strategic importance as a provider of coal to London ensured that the resumption of coal exports was a national priority. By March 1646, there were so many ships entering the Tyne carrying ballast to return with coal that the accumulation of dumped ballast was deemed dangerous for navigation. We're told that ships that had 8 foot of water at the quay last October now only have 4. Moreover, the occupation that followed the siege brought a notable increase in certain types of trade, which benefited the people living in areas like Newburn. In particular, the trade between England and Scotland saw supplies of muskets, pistols, and swords coming in to supply the occupying force, while Newcastle's domestic production had restarted and it was exporting. Not even the war against the Dutch in 1652-4 could put a damper on trade. And by 1655, the corporation had found the money, nearly £10,000 in total, to start construction of a new Guildhall and exchange on Sandhill. Indeed, the ruinous impact of that Second Civil War on the region would push us in a very different, radical direction. The Mayor of Newcastle and 80 freemen petitioned Parliament in October 1648, requesting, and I'm quoting, that full and exemplary justice be done upon the great incendiaries of the kingdom. They were talking about the king and his aides, the fomenters of and actors in the First and Second War, and the late bringing in of the Scots. The people of Newcastle were blaming the crown for bringing the Scots army in on us and disrupting trade. Charles's execution in January 1649 occasioned no regret from the town's leaders, merely disappointment that he died like a desperate, ignorant Roman, nothing we could see in him tending to a true Christian. Amongst the 59 men who signed the king's death warrant was Newcastle's MP, John Blakiston. The high proportion of northern MPs amongst the regicides may well reflect hopes in the region that cutting off the king's head would also sever the union between England and Scotland and end any further danger of the Scots invading in support of their king. But of course, the Scots did invade England a 4th time in 1651, this time in the cause of Charles II. The overwhelming reaction amongst Northerners to Cromwell's subsequent defeat of the Scots at Dunbar and at Worcester and the conquest of Scotland was probably one of wearied relief. Northumberland suffered its final invasion when the Scots army in Scotland under General George Monk crossed the border late in 1659. He was going to London, and he was carrying out a bloodless campaign that would end with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Newcastle, ever astute to its best interests, sent a loyal address to Charles II, expressing the hope that he would unite a divided church, compose a distracted kingdom, and ease an oppressed people. Let us get on with it, is basically what they're saying. But the legacy of 2 decades on the front line of Britain's civil wars could not be washed away so easily. The thread of Scottish invasion steadily receded from the 1650s, but would become an issue again in 1745 with the Stuart Rebellion. However, the trauma of war, occupation, and regicide had opened divisions in local society that would linger for generations. Thank you very much. I hope that you've enjoyed that and that you'll get a chance to listen to the other of the 2 talks about Newburn, recorded by my colleague, John Sadler. There are some other very good talks being organised as part of this series. And I'd like to thank Judith Green and St. James's Heritage Group, as well as Newcastle City Libraries and Information Service, for giving us a chance to actually tell you a bit about this stuff. Thanks very much. Bye.